Hello and welcome to the latest installment of DCI's Wednesday webinar series. This is Keo Sadie. I'm a senior consultant here at DCI Consulting, and I'm with my esteemed colleague Emily Tyson. The two of us work on the personnel selection and litigation support team under Dr. Eric Dunleavy, and we'll be talking about predicting employee turnover with validated selection procedures today. Some quick housekeeping. Remember that participant phone lines are muted, but if you have any questions, you're welcome to submit them to questions@dciconsult.com. Any technical difficulties during the call can be submitted to questions@dciconsult.com. And then for DCI clients who are on the line, if you'd like a copy of the presentation, you can request it through that same website, or web address rather. The information in this PowerPoint is provided for general information purposes only. These materials are not intended to provide legal advice. These materials are copyrighted and may not be reproduced, copied, or used without prior permission from the office. And then just a little bit about DCI. For those of you who are not familiar with our firm, our website is www.dciconsult.com, and we're a risk management human resource consulting firm. Our primary focus is on equal employment opportunity, affirmative action compliance, statistical analyses, and validation research, which is the bulk of what Emily and I and our colleagues on the personnel selection and litigation support team do. We have proprietary software for affirmative action planning, adverse impact analyses, and compensation analysis. And our client base is a diverse set of Fortune 500 and smaller organizations across a wide range of industries. Our consulting services include affirmative action plan development, statistical analyses of systemic discrimination allegations, selection procedure development and validation, proactive EEO audits, and litigation OCCP audit consulting. So the agenda for today, we'll talk a little bit about the value of good selection, although this topic was covered quite extensively in the September 9th webinar series. So if you haven't seen that, please review that from our website. A lot of good information present in that presentation. We'll then transition pretty quickly to the idea of big data and predictive analytics, two terms that I think everybody on the phone has probably heard ad nauseum at this point. We'll talk about what those mean and then how that relates to what we know as industrial organizational psychologists. As an extension of that, we'll talk about choosing what to predict in deploying predictive analytics, and specifically get into an example of trying to develop a system that provides an indication of applicants' turnover or retention risk prior to being hired into the job. We'll end with a slide on legal requirements and how what we do at DCI is in many ways robust with respect to defending against legal challenges.
So we're going to start first with just talking through really the value of good selection. So the first question really comes up, what are we talking about when we say the term selection? And we actually pulled from Barrett Field Gatewood in 2011 for a formal definition. And what they define as selection really is the process of collecting and evaluating information about an individual in order to extend an offer of employment. That's a really good starting definition, but at the end of the day, selection itself could actually refer to a variety of other employment decisions, such as things as hiring, promotion, transfer, and even termination. As Keo mentioned just a little bit ago, We have a webinar, the September 9th webinar that we did that actually dives a little bit deeper into selection. So if you're interested in really seeing that, I would suggest revisiting that presentation. That was actually entitled Employee Selection, What Federal Contractors Need to Know. So knowing that we really can look at selection systems across a variety of different employment decisions, really what does it mean when we're talking about that a selection system is valuable? Really when we're looking into this, we're looking at a two-pronged identification of value. The first is really from the organizational value perspective. We want to make sure that we are improving our quality human capital decisions. So if we're talking selection into a position, do we have the right people for the job? And that's really going to allow us to have confidence that we're selecting those that are most likely to add value to the organization. On the other hand, we also have the concern of legal defensibility. From an organizational perspective, to defend any legal actions here, you really want to make sure that what you're looking at is job related and is consistent with business necessity, so that you're actually hiring people if that's the selection decision that we're talking about. You're really focusing on aspects and selecting on aspects that are critical to be successful in that position. And this is really important if that system actually comes to be challenged.
The only thing I would add with respect to that is that these two concepts in terms of the quality of human capital decisions and legal defensibility are not divorced from one another, and they really work hand in hand, such that to the extent that sufficient research has been done and documented to demonstrate that, in fact, whatever process or procedure is being used to make decisions does truly add organizational value, with the appropriate documentation that is likely to be legally defensible. All right, so this section we'll be talking about big data and predictive analytics and what that means in the EEO world. So I think it's safe to assume that we've all heard these terms thrown around. They're on television. They're all over the internet. But the question is, what do these really mean? So when we talk about big data, one conception of big data is really that it's defined by three characteristics. That there is a lot of it, that the variety of the information is significant, and that over time the inputs or the data are changing quickly. The predictive analytics piece is really something that is pretty straightforward and not really a new practice in personnel selection world. Using statistical techniques such as regression analytic procedures, something that we use rather extensively here at DCI, to analyze data patterns and arrive at predictions about future outcomes of interest. And to the extent that in archival data, you can pick up patterns among various data fields that relate to some outcome of interest, you can use that information to try and predict ahead of time the outcome of interest in the future. Organizations are realizing the power of data and statistical analysis for making people decisions, and this reads that organizations are realizing. I think it may be better framed as organizations have realized. Some of the questions that surround the people decisions and using data to make them are, how do we identify and source the best talent? How do we retain talent? Who should we promote? How do we measure performance so that we can make decisions based on that? On what basis should employees be paid? Do different employees prefer different employee value propositions such that there are profiles for what folks expect to get out of the organization if they contribute their inputs. Research and knowledge in this area is not new, and frankly, IO psychologists have concentrated on this research area for nearly a century. In World War I, IO psychologists, this was really one of the first systematic attempts at applying psychological principles to work, IO psychologists were charged with developing systems to identify the appropriate soldier profile for particular jobs. And really that came down to what are the demands of the different roles and how do we measure whether people have the characteristics that are necessary to meet those demands such that soldiers could be marshaled into the appropriate roles prior to actually going out overseas.
So now that really brings us to the question, you know, we've talked about the value of good selection and why we want to strive to have a quality system to select individuals. And we talked about this big data, the predictive analytics, and being able to really see into the future and how to predict certain outcomes. Now really comes the crux of the question is, what are we really choosing to predict? And so in short, you can really say that organizations typically want to look at employee performance. And organizations are really interested in predicting employee behavior that organizations value and that helps an organization achieve its business objective. That's really how we define employee performance. But then the next question is, well, how are we operationalizing that? When we talk about this and trying to identify how and what we're going to predict, this really falls into two camps. Those criteria that are really more objective in nature versus subjective in nature. And when we say objective, we're talking really about things that you can see, feel, touch, count, things like error rates, how fast something is produced on a line, whether or not your employees turnover or leave the organization, the number of safety incidents that you have, you know, your sales volume, the amount that your employees are selling, or absenteeism or really tardiness on the job. Those are types of employee performance that would really be housed in that objective camp. When we talk more about subjective types of employee performance, we're really looking at things such as evaluations, and those can vary on what their focal point is. We can talk about evaluations against clear behavioral standards. That's really looking at whether or not an employee has effective performance for the job. You can also evaluate employees against others in the organization, really a rank ordering, so to speak. You can look at evaluations of promotability, whether or not they're ready for promotion into the next role. Do they have the characteristics to be successful in that next role? And also evaluations of potential. Those are your high potential employees or candidates, so to speak.
A final point with respect to this dichotomy. It's important to recognize that simply because some measure of employee performance is derived from a subjective or judgmental process doesn't mean that it's not useful. And as IO psychologists, what we typically try and evaluate is the extent to which the process that's in place to arrive at that performance rating or that performance metric that is based on often managerial judgments, that process is structured in such a way that the numbers or the indicators of the employee's performance can really be trusted as reliable, valid indicators.
Exactly. So then in the journey of choosing what we're actually going to predict, what outcome is really of interest, there are three other questions that we can ask ourselves. The first is really, what does the organization value? As you look back to the previous slide, we talked about things from the objective. Is it error rates, errors on the job? Or we talked about safety incidents. You want to reduce the number of those. And then, of course, turnover, which is really the focal point of this presentation.
On the subjective side, it might be the extent to which the employee consistently demonstrates the values of the organization and performs the core competencies at a level of proficiency that's expected.
Exactly. And once you have an idea of what the organization values, then you start thinking of really implementation here. What can be measured reliably? If it's not something that we can consistently measure in an accurate way, then maybe we'll steer away from that. We really want to focus on things that we can, from a measurement standpoint, see in a reliable fashion. And then we want to see what can be measured practically. Some things may be of value and you can measure them, but maybe the time and cost involved is just too much and it's not really feasible for the organization to focus on. So employee turnover, it is something that's costly to organizations. It doesn't suffer from the potential rater bias that some subjective measures might actually suffer from, and Kao pointed out that we strive to reduce those from the IO psychology perspective, rater biases and subjective measures. But this one is the objective form, so it doesn't suffer from that potential bias. And it's also an outcome that is really readily available from organizational HRIS systems. For that reason, or those reasons really, we thought that this was an interesting thing to focus on for this particular presentation. So turnover is really an ideal candidate for a predictive analytics study.
So let's talk a little bit about turnover, or on the flip side, retention. What we know from the research literature and our experience at DCI in terms of what sorts of things matter with respect to whether people stay on the job for an extended period of time or don't. So some upfront considerations when we conduct predictive analytics studies, or what we call validation studies, to predict turnover for our clients. The first thing we really want to think about is, how is turnover captured in the HRIS? So is it one column that indicates whether somebody left the organization or didn't? Is it a date indicating when they left or didn't? Are there specific codes differentiating folks who left based on voluntary reasons, such as they just walked off the job, or they quit with notice, or they had to relocate, versus involuntary decisions, such as they were terminated for performance issues, or absenteeism, tardiness issues, or some sort of workplace aggression incident. So the first step is really understanding what turnover looks like in the database that will be used for the predictive analytics study. And then the second step is, if there are multiple categories, what's the base rate for each of the categories? Is it useful to actually, in the study, differentiate the different forms or different reasons for turnover, such that there are a sufficient number of people that have left the organization for the particular reason that make a study of that particular outcome relevant. Once the criteria to predict are defined, the question becomes how to identify the predictors of those outcomes. The IO literature is rather extensive with respect to turnover. It's been studied for many, many years. We tend to categorize the drivers of turnover really as three things. First, the organizational job characteristics that may result in turnover. The applicant characteristics, so what people bring to the table that makes them likely to turn over. And then really what it comes down to is the interaction of the two. The job demands and characteristics married to the applicant profile is effectively what drives turnover in organizations. And in a selection context, when we're trying to develop a tool up front that will help identify folks before they're hired, help identify those folks who are likely to leave the organization in the near term, what we're really trying to do is differentiate those who are likely to leave the organization from those who are likely to stay for a significant period of time, based on some upfront information we can collect from them.
We thought we'd dive into a little bit deeper what these drivers really look like, and the types of questions to really ask when you're thinking about these drivers. So the first one really focuses on the organizational and job characteristics that influence turnover. So you can think of this in a couple different areas. What are the fundamental duty areas of the job? For instance, do they have to manage people or lead people in the organization? You can look at, what are the working conditions on the job? Is it shift work, or are there harsh working conditions that they might need to work in? What's the pay of the job? You can also look at the organizational culture in general. Is it more competitive in nature, or is it a supportive type of organizational culture? Then you can really focus on the personal characteristics that influence turnover as well. What is the personality profile of the applicant? Are they energetic and gregarious? What knowledge, skills, and ability does the applicant have? Do they have knowledge of finance? Or is there a background in chemistry? What does the applicant find fulfilling in life outside work? So what are their hobbies and interests really? Do they enjoy working outdoors or working with their hands? What is a stressful situation to the applicant? We're really looking at sort of stress triggers here. For someone, is it really speaking in front of others? And then the real question that can come down to really that interaction and marrying those two together. Is there a fit, so to speak, between the organizational job characteristics and the personal characteristics that we're looking at in our applicants or our candidates? So really, what's the person-organization fit? Excuse me. What is the fit between the applicant's experiences and preferences and the characteristics of the organization itself? Then you can also look at the fit between the personal characteristics and the job characteristics. And then, of course, the social support in the organization can influence that depending on personal characteristics that are measured.
All right, so what are the, kind of the nuts and bolts for how we set up these studies when we do these for clients in order to develop a selection procedure up front to predict turnover? Really the first step in these studies in terms of how we approach it is really going out, conducting some field research to understand the duties of the job, the required characteristics for doing that job well, and then the overall job context. So that can speak to the conditions in which the job is performed, all the way up to what is the organizational culture, what does a successful individual tend to look like from a characteristics perspective. Part of this includes discussions with management about their individual theories and observations with respect to what drives turnover. So one thing we're very careful to do is not to let valuable information slip through the cracks. Managers live and breathe employees, employee performance, and employee selection and attrition processes, and are very sensitive typically to employees leaving because of the costs incurred and the disruption typically in work that happens when individuals leave. And so because managers are often keen to sort of focus in on turnover, they often have put quite a bit of thought into what makes a successful candidate for the job, who tends to stick around versus what is sort of the general profile in their estimation of people who tend not to work out very well. And so we conduct focus groups, interviews with managers to make sure we capture their theories and that information. Some of which is often not a surprise to us and just really confirms some theories that we have going in, but other times there's some real unique insight that we think is very important to include in the experimental self-report inventory. So once we've done our field research, what we do is develop a structured set of questions with a structured set of responses that applicants can provide to each of the questions based on our understanding of the critical job duties, based on our understanding of the critical knowledge, skills, abilities, other characteristics required to do the job well and last a long time, our understanding of the job context and the organizational sort of general culture, and then the information we've collected from managers in terms of what they think the primary drivers of turnover are. So this experimental self-report inventory may range from 30 questions to potentially 80 questions, and we work with our clients to balance the need for comprehension on the front end versus the time it will take for individuals to actually complete the survey during the study. So once we have our experimental self-report inventory developed and it's been vetted both internally extensively and also with our clients with whom we're working, we use the inventory to collect data from new hires. So the way this works is that individuals would continue to be hired into a particular job using the existing practices, and during orientation or early on in the job, they complete the inventory, and we enter those data into a database. So once a sufficient period of time has passed, and well, I should say initially, once we have enough individuals who have completed the inventory to make the statistical analyses informative and worthwhile, we sit tight and allow enough time to pass such that we actually observe turnover in the job. And usually when we're brought in to conduct this research and develop these sorts of upfront selection tools, it's for particular positions that have experienced historically significant amounts of turnover. So at this point, we have changed nothing. All we have done is really collected information about new hires, and we would expect similar levels of turnover in the past. Once a sufficient period of time has gone by and the job has experienced what the historical numbers of turnover would suggest, we then work with our clients to pull the turnover records from the HRIS and match candidate responses to turnover status. We then evaluate the data such that we identify those particular questions from the experimental inventory that seem to differentiate high turnover from low turnover depending on how people respond. We develop a scoring algorithm using often quite sophisticated statistical techniques and combine overall item scores into a total score and then relate those total scores to turnover. So folks who tend to have higher scores such that they tend to respond in particular ways to the experimental items of interest, do they tend to have lower turnover than folks that tend to have lower scores? Often those scores will range from 0 to 15, for example, if they're, the final metadata inventory is 15 questions. And what we like to do is identify sort of broader groupings across, or what we call risk bands. So do folks who, in my example of 0 to 15, folks who tend to score between 11 and 15, they tend to be our low turnover group. There's low turnover for that group of employees. Versus the middle band from a score of 6 to 10, those folks tend to turn over at a better rate than what we were seeing historically, but it's higher than what we see in our low risk band, 11 to 15. And then everyone below that is a high risk for turnover. So what we can do at this point then is implement the system such that new hires take the not the entire experimental inventory, but just the 15-item inventory, and based on how they respond to the 15 items, they get slotted into a low turnover risk band, a moderate risk, or a high risk band. And our clients often want to avoid hiring from that high risk band, and if at all possible, hire exclusively from the low turnover risk band. Okay, and as a final slide, we just want to talk a little bit about the legal considerations of implementing these sorts of, well, first of all, using these sorts of predictive analytics to identify a system for selecting employees. What I described in the hypothetical turnover study is a criterion-related validation study, really. And that is a study that's endorsed by the Uniform Guidelines on Employee Selection Procedures, such that to the extent that that research produces sufficient evidence that the selection procedure is truly job-related, consistent with business necessity, and represents a process for which there are no suitable alternatives that would produce lower adverse impact, it's a system that is legally defensible. And just one word of caution that we would have for our clients out there is using predictive analytics to make people decisions without a basis in theory and extensive research like we've described can create legal liability and may not actually be getting you what you want. And so simply data mining without a full understanding of what you're measuring, why it actually is related to the outcome of interest, and without sort of a full comprehensive research plan may introduce legal liability, even if it's the organization's thought that it is doing what the organization wants it to do. And with that, almost exactly at 30 minutes, we'll end our Wednesday webinar. If you have any questions, again, please submit them to questions@dciconsult.com. And again, for our clients, if you'd like to see the presentation, we'd be happy to send it to you upon request. Thank you all very much.